Welcome to this deep dive. We're looking again at the latest insights from EU versus Disinfo.
Right.
Specifically, we're zeroing in on their disinformation review covering April 7th to 13th, 2025, and also a really interesting network analysis piece they put out.
Yeah, that network analysis is quite something.
And like always, we're not just doing a news roundup here. The mission is really to unpack the key trends, the tactics we're seeing.
Exactly. And since our audience, follows this stuff closely, we can probably skip the basics and get into the more strategic aspects.
Perfect. So let's start with the disinformation review. That piece from April 10th. Play this up, play that down, repeat the lie. It mentions the ceasefire talk again.
Ah, yes, the classic yes, but approach from Russia. It's a familiar pattern, isn't it?
It really is.
They signal some openness maybe to a ceasefire, but then immediately cloud it with all these conditions, these questions.
So it creates ambiguity, makes it hard to pin down.
Precisely. It's not just about stalling. It sort of actively muddies the waters, makes any real progress seem, well, almost impossible.
And this happens against that grim backdrop of what's happening on the ground. The review specifically uses the Kryvyi missile attack from April 4th as a case study.
A really stark one. And they frame it, importantly, not just as violence, but as strategic communication.
How so?
Well, think about it. Striking Zelensky's hometown, that sends a message, doesn't it? A show of force right alongside this, supposed openness to talks.
Right.
And the review, it really highlights the civilian targeting. It's just horrific. We're talking 9 high-rise buildings hit.
The playground.
A playground, over 30 cars destroyed, schools, a restaurant, the human cost, 20 killed, over 70 injured. And that included children.
Just awful.
And it wasn't, accidental. The scale of it points to deliberate targeting of civilian life.
And the Kremlin's response? Predictable, I assume.
Absolutely. The review details it, follows the script. Outright denial, fabrication.
What did they claim this time?
Claimed they hit 85 soldiers, including some alleged NATO officers, plus 20 vehicles. And Peskov, their spokesperson, explicitly denied any civilian targets were hit.
And they repeated this?
Yep. Repeated these lies right at the UN Security Council on April 8th.
Wow.
And the review, quite rightly, points out this isn't new. It fits a pattern we've seen for, 3 years now. Attacks on civilians in Bucha, Mariupol, Kramatorsk,
Kharkiv, Kakhovka,
Odessa, Dnipro. The list just goes on. Kryvyi is tragically just the latest example of this strategy.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. The review also touched on Russia's attempts at economic sweet-talking, particular towards the U.S., maybe the Trump sphere.
Yeah. It seems pretty optimistic on their part, doesn't it, given the reality?
How so?
Well, the review points out the huge gap between what Moscow wants and the actual situation. U.S.-Russia economic ties are, heavily restricted by sanctions.
And the asset seizures don't help, I imagine?
Exactly. The nationalization of foreign assets, American ones included, without proper compensation. That's killed a lot of trust. Plus, companies are still leaving Russia, not applying to come back.
So, into this picture steps Kirill Dmitriev, the investment banker turned diplomat.
That's the one. The review reminds us he didn't have much luck with the Sputnik V vaccine approval at the WHO.
Right, I remember that.
Now he's apparently trying to charm the U.S., proposing joint projects, minerals, resources, that kind of thing.
And he made some claim about U.S. losses.
He did. Claimed the U.S. lost $300 billion by leaving the Russian market. The review basically calls that figure baseless.
Which makes sense. The real losses seem to be for the companies whose assets were well taken.
Precisely. European-American companies, often with little hope of getting fair value back.
Okay, the disinformation review also flagged some other narratives doing the rounds last week. What else stood out?
Well, there was this idea pushed about Germany leading a war against Russia.
Linked to the Rearm Europe initiative.
Exactly. It's a classic smear campaign framing defensive moves as offensive intent. The review is very clear. It's just not based on facts.
And the old Russophobia claim.
Still there. The idea that European leaders invent Russophobia to distract from their own economic problems. A very predictable line.
Then there was Pushkov.
Yeah.
Alexei Pushkov.
Yes, with his sort of updated, encircled Russia myth.
What's new about it?
Now it includes this idea of a global deep state. Britain, France, Germany, all part of it, apparently.
And the review connects this to internal Russian politics.
Correctly. Links it to the increase in military conscription in Russia and, the buildup to the May 9th Victory Day, which is always heavy on nationalist and militarist messaging. It justifies mobilization.
Makes sense.
Another nasty one was the claim that the big five EU countries, presumably France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland, will force Ukraine to fight until the last Ukrainian is killed.
That's grim.
It is. And the review contrasts it sharply with the reality, which is Russia's continued aggression. They also noted Channel 1 using fabricated footage.
Like what?
There was an example about completely inventing comments supposedly made at a soldier's mother's grave. Just manufacturing sentiment.
Really dark stuff.
Truly manipulative. Exploiting grief, sowing division. It really shows the lack of ethical boundaries.
And finally, from the review, the ongoing efforts targeting Moldova.
Yes, persistent pressure there, especially around their elections, recent presidential, upcoming parliamentary.
Same kind of narratives.
Pretty much. Claims the EU and US are destroying traditional values, that democracy is just a facade, trying to undermine trust in Western ties and democratic processes.
To pull Moldova back into Russia's orbit.
That seems to be the goal. Playing the traditional values card is a standard part of that playbook.
Okay, so that covers the main points from the disinformation review piece. Now let's talk about that other analysis you mentioned, the network analysis.
Right, the EES piece from April 9th, Enter the Galaxy, a network analysis of influence operations. It frames foreign information manipulation and interference FUMI as a serious security threat.
And it uses this galaxy metaphor.
Yeah, talking about a galaxy of interconnected threat actors. And an iceberg analogy for the Feeney exposure matrix.
Okay, break that down. Iceberg.
Meaning you have the overt channels, the stuff you see above the waterline, like official state media. But then there's this huge hidden part, the covert channels, operating below the surface.
And the key point is they're connected.
Exactly. It's not separate systems. They form a unified network. Attributed channels, like, say, Russia Today, interact with non-attributed ones. They identified something like 38,000 unique channels and did a deeper dive on over 2,000 active ones.
So who are the big players, the brightest stars in this galaxy?
Well, no surprise, sanctioned Russian state outlets like RT and Sputnik are key nodes, and their Chinese equivalents like Global Times and Xinhua.
But Russia also uses less obvious channels.
Definitely. Things like Doppelganger, which looks kind of independent but isn't, or the African Initiative. And then purely non-attributed operations like Portal Combat and False Facade.
What are those used for?
Content laundering, basically.
Yeah.
Making disinformation look like it came from somewhere else, somewhere more legitimate, maybe.
And China, similarly scripted.
Broadly, yes. State-controlled outlets are key nodes, amplified by diplomatic accounts, but they also use seemingly independent channels for more covert stuff.
And this network operates across different platforms.
All of them. X, Facebook, Telegram, YouTube, TikTok, fake news websites.
Yeah.
You name it. And using all sorts of formats. Videos, articles, memes, even AI-generated content now.
Can you give an example of how this works in practice, this laundering and amplification?
Sure. The report used the narrative about Zelensky's legitimacy. It apparently started with a YouTube publication.
Okay.
Then it gets repackaged by one of those covert outlets like False Facade. Then amplified on Telegram, then picked up by a slightly more visible but still aligned outlet like Newsfront.
Right.
And only then does it get amplified by the big guns like Sputnik and maybe even the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. See the progression?
Yeah, it's like washing it through different layers until it seems almost mainstream.
Exactly. And it's not always one way. Sometimes overt sources feed ideas back into the covert channels too. It's a dynamic system.
Does the analysis mention interaction between, say, Russian and Chinese networks?
It does. They observed cross-promotion between Russian and Chinese FEMI clusters, often pushing similar narratives, especially ones targeting Western institutions or democratic processes. Common ground there.
What are the key patterns they identified in how these networks operate?
A few things. Coordinated activation, hitting multiple channels almost simultaneously with the same message.
Okay.
Content recycling, taking one piece of disinformation and tweaking it slightly for different audiences or platforms.
Makes sense. Efficiency.
And audience segmentation, tailoring the message depending on who they're trying to reach.
So, wrapping this all up, looking at both the disinfo review and this network analysis, what are the big takeaways for this week?
Well, from the review, it's the continued cynical use of tactics around the Ukraine war, the Kryvyi Rih attack narrative, the ceasefire games. plus the ongoing economic influencing attempts and the targeting of places like Moldova.
And the network analysis shows the complex machinery behind it all.
Exactly. It reveals this interconnected, adaptable infrastructure for FINI. It's not just isolated incidents, it's a system, a persistent one.
Which underlines how important it is to see these patterns, right? Beyond just reacting to one fake story here or there.
Absolutely. Understanding how the network, the laundering, the amplification is as crucial as knowing the what.
So, a final thought then, perhaps for our listeners to consider. If these influence operations are so interconnected, as the network analysis suggests, what does that mean for how we should even try to spot or counter disinformation, especially campaigns that might target specific sectors, maybe finance or energy or health, that seem totally separate from, say, geopolitics at first glance? Could they still be linked in this wider network?
That's a really interesting question. How seemingly disparate campaigns might actually be coordinated or serve a larger hidden agenda? Definitely something to think about.